So we believe that these things are real, looking at them in any number of different ways. Back to population attributable risk. This is obviously pretty bad on an individual basis, but how big an issue is this in the overall population? Well, if you look at current depression, you can account for a bit more than half of all current depression by adverse childhood experiences. If you look at chronic depression, you can account for about 40%. And if you look at suicide attempts, you can account for somewhere between a half and 2/3 of all suicide attempts by adverse childhood experiences. Think how that observation conflicts with the usual, something must have snapped, etc. We looked at rape, which I once naively thought was relatively uncommon, and quickly learned in the weight program was remarkably common. The only thing uncommon about it was that nobody's ever going to bring it up on their own, and certainly the rest of us are too polite to ask. So when we started asking routinely, we found rather interesting things. In a general middle-class population, at A-score 0, the prevalence of rape is 5%, which I find amazingly high. At an A-score of 4 or higher, the prevalence is 33%, which is really rather extraordinary. You'll have a chance to ask me some questions, but here's one I'd like to ask you. How does that work? Why does that happen? How does what happens to a little girl predispose her to being raped later in life? What are the intermediary links that make that happen? We looked at promiscuity, which we defined as having 50 or more lifetime sexual partners. Some patients were nice enough to explain to me that I should understand that there were some people for whom 50 or more sexual partners would be a slow year. And that's true. But nevertheless, using our conservative estimate here, or definition, what we saw is that as the A-score goes up, the likelihood of high-level promiscuity goes up significantly. And gradually I came to see that what we probably are looking at here is the quest for love. That if somebody will have sex with me, maybe I'm lovable. Or pornography being the graphical depiction of that. Here, we're looking at A-score compared to unintended pregnancy and elective abortion. A-score goes up, likelihood of unintended pregnancy goes up, likelihood of elective abortion goes up. So sort of a running summary now, as the A-score goes from 0 to 5 or more, the likelihood of being the victim of intimate partner violence goes up over 5-fold. The likelihood of being raped goes up almost 9-fold. And population attributable risk, you can account for about 2/3 of all rape by adverse childhood experiences. You can account for about half of being the victim of domestic violence by adverse childhood experiences. And then we looked at the making of madness. And what you see here is that as the A-score goes up, the likelihood of hallucinations goes up quite significantly, such that at A-score 7 or higher, you're looking at a prevalence of 10% for hallucinations. And you might say, yeah, but I mean, with an A-score that high, surely people are going to be using street drugs or alcohol to try to modulate the way they feel, which is an interesting insight, isn't it? And maybe the hallucinations are due to the drugs or the alcohol. So we corrected for the drugs and alcohol and with the white lines, and you see essentially the same relationship. To look at that a different way, we looked at the prescription rates for antipsychotic medications about 50 to 60 years later. And again, you see, as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of being prescribed antipsychotic medications a half century later goes up in the same stepwise, proportionate manner. And we looked at then prescriptions for anti-anxiety medications. Why would somebody be chronically anxious? I mean, it's not a question that one sensibly asks. And what you see is again the same relationship going back a half century. So we ended up realizing that adverse childhood experiences determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. And they do that by being the underpinnings for the risk factors for the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. Those are the things that we've been talking about thus far. You see, it was a huge advance 60 years ago when we began to think about risk factors largely as a virtue of the Framingham study. Now we're on the threshold of looking at the determinants of risk factors. Why is someone an alcoholic? Why is someone an intractable smoker? Why is someone a drug user? Etc. With an ACE score of 0, we found that the majority of these 17,500 adults have few, if any, risk factors for these diseases. I mean, no internist is going to earn a living here. With an ACE score of 4 or more, the majority of these adults either have multiple risk factors for the 10 most common causes of death or the diseases themselves. And an ACE score of 4 or more is reflective of 1 in 6 people in a very middle-class population. If you then start talking about people in prison, people who are homeless, etc., it's obvious that the percent is going to be higher, not lower. So here we're looking at the marvels of big medicine, liver transplants, coronary bypass, intestinal bypass, taking the latest in antidepressant medications. We spend so much time dealing with the consequences that we have little time to ponder the core reasons why these approaches are needed. In other words, many chronic diseases in adult life are determined decades earlier in childhood, not by diseases of childhood, but by life experiences of childhood. This is a really interesting concept, the translation of life experience into biomedical disease given time, by 2 broad mechanisms. One is the use of coping devices that are intermediary mechanisms for damage, and the other is the effect of chronic stress and its impact on organ damage. We saw also that the things that we call risk factors for these chronic diseases are certainly that. But maybe more important, they're reliable markers for earlier problems. T.S. Eliot had a wonderful way of putting this: in my end is my beginning. The way we dismiss health risks, so-called, as bad habits or dysfunctional behavior comfortably conceals their functionality. And it really leads our gaze away from where the action is. A lot is lost by not understanding the functionality of so-called health risk behaviors. We looked at other things too. For instance, we looked at how ACE score plays out against self-acknowledged difficulty doing one's work properly. You see, as the ACE score goes up, the self-acknowledgement of that goes up.